subject. We mentioned last week regarding Sahaba radiallahu anhum are a group of companions that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose to be the companions of Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And similar to the Hawariyin or the disciples of Isa alayhi salam, we know that the Hawariyin were the companions, comrades of Isa alayhi salam, and the sheer number of the companions that are narrated, 100,000 plus. Some mention 120,000, 124,000. The different numbers exist in regards to the exact number of companions. We went over very briefly last week who is considered a companion, a Sahabi, and the rankings amongst the Sahaba radiallahu anhum. We mentioned, for example, the Khulafa Rashidun are the highest ranking amongst the companions, and then you find the Ashara al-Bashara, you find the companions who participated in the Battle of Badr, the companions who participated in the Battle of Uhud, the companions who participated in the Bay'at al-Ridwan, Bay'at al-Aqaba, and this is how the scholars, they kind of list off if we ever wanted to get an understanding in regards to the rank. But the unanimous opinion is that the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, we as later generations can never equal to even the lowest ranking Sahaba. We never have that ability. So for us to be later generations, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us, later generations, one of the signs of the Day of Judgment is that later generations try to find faults of the previous generations. So this is a major sign of the Day of Judgment, is that later generations find faults of the previous generations. So we find amongst us nowadays that there are people who mention regarding the faults of the Sahaba radiallahu anhu. So again, we went over that very briefly last week, that we should never join in any of those conversations. If we ever find that a discussion or a group of people are discussing this, we should immediately excuse ourselves. If we don't have the capacity to stop that, then we should excuse ourselves immediately from such discussions and conversations. And we gave some examples of the popular topics, if you want to say, nowadays, is that they find, for example, they'll mention about Amir Muawiyah radiallahu anhu. Some people discuss regarding the battle of the camel, Jang al-Jamal or Jang al-Siffin, and then they mentioned that who was right, who was wrong, Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu, Sayyidina Aisha radiallahu anhu. This does not concern us. We are, after all, children. We are children in comparison to the generation of Sahaba radiallahu anhu. And it seems to happen on an annual basis. On an annual basis, these discussions come back up, they pop their head up. The fitna sort of reintroduces itself on an annual basis. It's kind of like the annual debate regarding how there's Valentine's Day, and then there's Halloween, and there's Christmas. So now, as Muslims, there's an attempt to introduce an Islamic version of Valentine. There's an attempt to introduce an Islamic version of Halloween. They call it Halloween. So again, just like how those subjects are annual, similarly criticism, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect, criticism of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum is an annual thing. So again, this is just an opportunity for us to visit some of the hadith on this subject matter. Sayyidina Abu Sa'id al-Khudri radiallahu anhu narrates from the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, لا تسبوا أصحابي فوالذي نفسي بيدي لو أن أحدكم أنفق مثل أحد ذهبا ما أدرك مد أحدهم ولا نصيفه. Sayyidina Abu Sa'id al-Khudri radiallahu anhu mentioned, Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said that, do not speak ill of my companions. Do not speak ill of my companions, because Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam swore an oath that by the one whose hands is my soul, if any of you, meaning if any of you later generations were to spend equivalent to the amount of Uhud in gold, if we later generations were, hypothetically, if we were to spend equivalent to the amount of Uhud in gold, we would not even reach a very small amount of what the Sahaba radiallahu anhum spent in charity. The smallest amount that is imaginable. So this is one narration. Another narration is narrated by Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu. He says that لا تسبوا أصحاب محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم فلمقام أحدهم ساعة خير من عمل أحدكم عمره. Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, he mentions as well that never ever find yourself criticizing, speaking ill, or cursing the Sahaba radiallahu anhu. We should never find ourselves in such situations. Why? Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, he mentions that the companions of Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, their 1 hour of standing, their 1 hour of spending time in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is far better than our entire life of worship. If we were to equate in comparison. Another narration is found by Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu, he narrates from Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam that Khayrul Nas, this is a very famous saying, and every single week we recite this in Jum'ah, in the Khutbah al-Jum'ah. Khayrul Nas qarni, thumma alladhina yalunahum, thumma alladhina yalunahum. So the narrator, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu, he mentions that فَلَا أَدْرِي فِي الثَّالِثَةِ أَوْ فِي الرَّابِعَةِ قال ثم يتخلف من بعدهم خلف تسبق شهادة أحدهم يمينه ويمينه شهادته. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu mentions a very famous saying of Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, that Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam mentioned that the best of generations was the generation that Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam was found in. And then Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said that the next generation after that immediately following, and then the next generation immediately following that generation. And Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, he mentioned that he's not 100% sure if it was stopped at the 3rd or the 4th generation. Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said that then after that, people will become, you'll find a lot of disagreement, ikhtilaf, and each of those later generations, their testimonies will go ahead of their oath, and their oath will go ahead of their testimonies, meaning it will not have any value. The later generations' testimonies and oaths will have no value. So again, when we look at this hadith, خير الناس قرني ثم الذين يلونهم ثم الذين يلونهم, we can just appreciate the fact that the example that is given here in this hadith, it basically says for us to understand that when we are in a room that has the light source, this room will be very bright. And when we move away from this room with the light source, just going further and further away from the light source, it becomes darker and darker and darker. So similarly, the generation of Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, that was the generation that had the source of light, Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So the generation that came after, they just went further and further away from the source of light, Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So we can just imagine the type of people, illa masha'Allah, the people that try to stick to the Quran and Sunnah of Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. We find small batches in later generations following the commandments of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Sunnah of Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. But the majority of the generations that are found later on are tainted, and there's great fitna in later generations. So again, these are reminders of the fadail wa manaqib, the virtues and the merits of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum. Next week, inshallah, we'll focus specifically on the manaqib of Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, the merits of Siddiq Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, inshallah, next week.
Thank you.